You are listening to the Cycling Podcast at the Giro d'Italia in association with Rapha, the fastest clothing in the world tour, the home of cycling with character. Ride and watch with Rapha in 2019 as they partner with EF Education First and Canyon SRAM.
Well, cheers, Daniel.
Cheers, Napalm. You gone with beer? It was a wine stage yesterday, of course. We didn't really take advantage, did we?
No.
Partly because of the now infamous technical problem that occurred in the evening.
You took it very well, Daniel. You took it very well. I turned up after 2 days off and messed everything up for you by failing to record our first take properly, and we had to redo everything from scratch.
Well, Lionel, we're making up for it because we had a lovely day, a lovely afternoon in Ravenna, where the race restarts tomorrow. We did some interviews this morning, didn't we? We did a nice visit to the Spazio Pantani, the Pantani Museum in Cesenatico. We ate some piadine in the Piadineria of the Pantani family.
We did. You'll hear all about that in an episode a little bit later this week. Not quite sure what we'll do with that yet. We will have an editorial conference over breakfast. Went for a run round Ravenna as well. Jolly nice. It's a nice town, isn't it, this?
Well, nice is a little bit of a...
Am I damning it?
I think you're damning it with very faint praise. Very illustrious city in Italy, associated with some very famous figures in Italian history. Dante, some very famous figures in English literary history as well. Shelley, Byron. What else is it famous for?
I don't know, Daniel. That's your department.
8 UNESCO World Heritage sites, most of them churches, with some fantastic mosaics and frescoes, which we'll be visiting. I hope to visit and get to know Ravenna better in the morning. It's not a place that I know particularly well, but I've always wanted to come here and spend some time here.
Yeah, some of the architecture, absolutely beautiful, and the pedestrianised centre where we're sitting now is lovely. This is the perfect end to the rest day, really, and as Daniel says, the race will resume tomorrow, but we have convened to take questions from the listeners, from you, the listeners, in our rest day press conference. Thank you very much for everyone who sent in a question, whether it was by WhatsApp or by email or text. We can't get to all of them, of course. There's too many questions, so we've had to be fairly judicious in our selection. But a lot of people this morning were asking whether or not yesterday's time trial performance spells the end of the Giro d'Italia hopes of Simon Yates. He's now 3:46 behind Primož Roglic. A lot of time to make up. Let's not forget, last year he was in a very strong position and then suffered that dramatic collapse in the final few days, put under a sort of relentless pressure from, among others, Chris Froome. And wonder whether he fancies his chances of turning the tables and doing the exact opposite this year. It's a tall order, but we were in Riccione this morning, not far from the Mitchelton Scott team hotel, so we decided we'd go along and put your question to him.
Set out with sort of a strategy, just to ride slightly below threshold for the first part and then really squeeze on the climb, which is what I would normally do anyway. But I got to the climb and just didn't have anything left. Not that I've emptied the tank to get there before. Just when I tried to step on the pedals, the legs just really didn't want to move. Like you just said, then my heart rate really wasn't going up. So I don't really know what's happened there. Really disappointing for myself personally.
Are you kind of maybe putting it down to the fact that I guess you rode a lot of huge climbs in training before the Giro? You hadn't really done any big climbs in the first 9 days of the race. I know a lot of small ones, but might that have something to do with it?
Yeah, maybe a little bit. I think a very similar thing has happened actually in the past in the Tour in 2015. We had 10 stages of nothingness, and then we got to the first mountain day there in the Pyrenees, I think it was, and everyone was really bad. There's only, I think Froome won the day there. He won by like a minute 40 or something to Quintana, and then the rest were even more behind. And that day there, I also had shit legs, a similar feeling. So it could be, but it's the same for everybody else. I'm not trying to make excuses. It's just that was the reason why I've gone shit. But maybe that was one of the factors. It's like the last 2 Grand Tours before this that I've done. We had really early mountain stages. In the Vuelta we had a really hard stage already, stage 4, and here last year stage 6 was already Mount Etna. So they were very different, and for sure we'll look into that in the future.
And what it does do is it sets you up to be aggressive in the second half of the race. Looking forward to sort of playing that attacking, spoiling role.
Yeah, unfortunately we still have even more days to wait. We have another rest day here now and another 2 days of nothingness for me personally. So we'll see. And I've worked too hard to just give up already now. So I'll give it everything I've got. If I come up short, then that's okay. And I know we still have some things to work on, so we'll go from there. Still a lot of other guys who are down as well, and Roglic, he's looking very, very impressive. So everyone is going to be having to attack him. Also Lopez is also down on time. He had a problem yesterday with the bike and lost some time there as well. So it's not just me who needs to make up a lot of time. So I can see it being very aggressive in maybe not the very immediate days coming up, obviously with the sprints, but as soon as we hit the mountains, I think it's going to be a very fast race. I've not been doing anything here. I've been in the wheels for 8 days already. I've done one effort before yesterday, which is the prologue, and actually all the other time I've not touched the wind yet. So if you look at it that way, I should have enough energy to last. It all depends on the situation, I guess, and how the rest of the race is going. And how my legs respond now as well. We don't know. Maybe I've managed to detrain myself in these 8 days before the start, and I'm actually not going good anymore. So we'll see once we get there. I've not spoken to Waddy in detail yet about what or how we approach these stages, these mountain stages. So we'll wait until then.
You can't lose your form though, can you, in 8 days? I mean, you can't detrain yourself that much unless you're ill, I suppose. Yeah,
it depends how you look at it as well. I eased a little bit before coming into the race to make sure I was fresh and I was ready for the race. So it depends how you look at it. Yeah, I don't know. I have to check the files, but you're looking at almost maybe 2 weeks of going a little bit easier than maybe I should have. And that's a long time. 2 weeks is a long time. So.
And I guess 2 weeks down from altitude as well, or more than 2 weeks.
Also. So, yeah, we can sit all day and discuss about what might happen and stuff, but we really need to wait, I think, until we get there and see how my body responds.
Did you ever talk to him, Simon Roglic?
Briefly, just I don't know him that well personally, but just normal conversation.
You know, he used to be a ski jumper.
I didn't know that one. Tell me about it.
And about the fact that normally in peloton, Mitchelton and Astana are considered stronger than Bahrain and Jumbo as team. Do you agree with this vision?
I think we have a really strong team here to be aggressive. Really, we've only been using the big guys to protect me on these flat stages here, so we still have all our climbers fresh once we get to the mountains. Of course, Astana, you see them in every race we go to. They have numerous guys there in the climbs, a very strong team. So, like I said, I think it's going to be fast racing once we get to the mountains.
And about Nibali, I mean, it was good in the time trial yesterday, and so definitely now certainly it's the closest to Roglic. In your opinion, was surprised for you his performance yesterday? Or?
No, he was really about where I thought he would be. Maybe not with how much time did he lose to Roglic?
1 minute and 5 seconds.
So what? Only 1 minute?
Yeah.
Yeah. It was around what I was hoping for myself, also.
Exactly.
So it's around what I would say he would. And he was looking good. Also, I watched the TV back again after. He looks nice on the bike. So yeah, we'll see once we get to the mountains.
I was struck by how calm and kind of mature Simon Yates was. Not that I was expecting him to not be calm and mature about it, but to suffer that setback yesterday and not really have a definitive answer as to what went wrong, it must be tough to take, especially when there's still 2 weeks of racing to go, and he's champing at the bit to try and recover some of those losses, and he's got to sit through 2 uneventful sprint stages before he even had any slim opportunity of regaining some time.
Yes, Lionel, and we spoke afterwards, after we heard from Simon Yates about how, in spite of all the advances and all the progress that's been made in terms of training and planning training loads, it's still an inexact science, or it can be, for these general classification contenders, and there are so many variables to control. As we heard there from Simon Yates, he had an idea of how his kind of form was going to sort of crescendo going through the Giro, and various things can interfere with that. One has undoubtedly been the weather, and I don't think it's even possible to understand what effect that's had on his form and other riders in the Giro's form. Another factor has been the route, and it was interesting there to hear him draw a parallel with the 2015 Tour de France. He was obviously at a very different stage in his career there. I think that was his first major tour, wasn't it? Or was it his second? It was his second.
He'd done the tour the previous year, starting in Yorkshire.
Yeah. But that does change things. I mean, one of the first times I heard about this idea of kind of losing form in the first week of a Grand Tour was when I remember Tim Kerrison talking about it at Sky. I forget which Tour de France that was, but it might have been the 2012 Tour.
Similar week for Bradley Wiggins, really.
Yeah, and obviously some of that is the route, but it can also be the way a race is actually raced. In this case, I think it's got a lot to do with the route. And Simon Yates, I've heard him speak before about his training, particularly in Andorra, and how it consists almost solely of riding up mountain passes a lot of the time. And you've got to imagine that he did a lot of climbing in his build-up to the Giro, and then of course these guys all sort of taper and take their foot off the gas a little bit in the week or so before the start of a Grand Tour. And I think he's got question marks about whether it's left him a little bit kind of undercooked.
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon, this, and I think one of us should ask one of the coaches, sports scientists on the race in the coming days about this. But what's the solution? We've seen really since sort of 2011-12, when Bradley Wiggins and Team Sky kind of popularised the warm down and also the warm up for stages on the turbo trainers or the rollers in some cases. I wonder whether at some point what's the solution? Could Simon Yates go back to the hotel and do a hard hour on the turbo just to give himself some intensity? I mean, it sounds absolutely daft.
It does. It sounds a preposterous notion, but when you hear Simon Yates say, I mean, we always kind of belittle the difficulty of stages and weeks like this week. We interview riders at the finish, and often we're guilty of saying, well, that was a pretty straightforward day, wasn't it? And they sort of look at you as though you're completely crazy and say, well, yeah, you should have been in there because it was really stressful.
Bristle, don't they?
But then you hear Simon Yates say today that he's done nothing, that he's just been in the wheels all week and he hasn't done a big effort. He hadn't done a big effort until yesterday. So maybe, I think what he told Matt White, I think, and he told other people yesterday after that time trial that he felt as though he needed, and he hadn't had a real kind of hit out, and that was what was lacking yesterday, and it was really about kind of blowing away the cobwebs. So he has that experience in 2015. I know in 2015 when he did have that sort of bad first day in the mountains, his sort of form returned quickly in subsequent days. So maybe that's all he needs. He just needs to blow away the cobwebs. But in the process of finding his climbing legs again, he's lost 3 valuable minutes.
Yeah, indeed. The other thing that occurred to me, the amount of information at their fingertips. We were talking a little bit, about that. I said I couldn't have begun running without Strava, frankly, because you have information in your hand. You can see whether you've set, what pace you're on and whether you've set out too hard. And yet that information also plays with your mind. And if you see, this is quicker than I can go, you suddenly feel like, well, perhaps I ought to back off then. I don't know. I mean, in the olden days, would Bernardino or Fausto Coppi have had any of nothing would have been clouding the thinking. I'm not saying in Simon Yates' case anything was clouding his thinking yesterday, but the simplicity of cycling seems to have kind of it's gone, hasn't it? It's now become a sort of scientific pursuit, and the notion of just stamp on the pedals and just get everything out. Sometimes the simplest things might well be the best solution, but we're not the experts here, are we? We know we don't know how his legs felt yesterday. He does. Sorry, Daniel. Some of the publicity caravan vehicles are driving into Ravenna here. A huge bottle of Astoria sparkling wine on the back of a flatbed truck. That's the Giro's arrived in town. They're a bit late.
It's parked up in town. It's parked up right in front of where we're recording this podcast.
Indeed.
The fastest clothing in the world tour, the home of cycling with character. Ride and watch with Rapha in 2019 as they partner with EF Education First and Canyons Ram.
Thank you to Rapha for sponsoring the cycling podcast. Now, yesterday when there was that terrible downpour, Daniel and I got soaked to the skin. Well, I didn't actually. I had my Rapha jacket on, and that kept the worst off again. Faithful Rapha jacket, keeping me drier than I could have reasonably expected in the conditions. Daniel made a bold play, saying, "Oh, I'm wet through. Can I wear one of the Pedaler de Charme t-shirts that's in the car?" And I had to say no. They are for the winners of the Pedaler de Charme competition, and you have to do some charming pedalling to deserve one.
What about just being charming generally? Surely I was,
I
was extremely charming in the first week.
Extremely charming when I wasn't here, but that's another story. As I say, thank you to Rapha for sponsoring the podcast. The time trial yesterday, Rapha's clothing was on the backs of the EF Education First riders. The Aero range is available to buy on rapha.cc. We will be presenting the Pedaler de Charme t-shirt to Marco Frapporti in a couple of days' time. And yes, thank you very much to Rapha for sponsoring the podcast. Now, we better get to some listeners' questions here. So let's have the first question.
Hello chaps, this is Aaron from Guildford, currently in sunny St Lucia. Been greatly enjoying your coverage of the Giro so far. My question is regarding the final GC shake-up. I appreciate this may require a certain degree of speculation, but given Richard's theories about Egan Bernal, which actually may be true now given he's smashing some KOMs in Andorra. But here we go anyway. Do you expect, or does the route lend itself to late stage attacking? Like in 2016, Nibali was 4 minutes behind on stage 19, or similar for Chris Froome in 2018, or do we expect Contador-style domination?
Well, Lionel, we heard noises to the effect that Simon Yates is certainly going to ride aggressively in this Giro. I think there are various riders who are going to ride aggressively, both because it's in their nature. I'm thinking about guys like Mikel Landa, but also because of the position they're in, and they need to make up some time fairly quickly. The route lends itself certainly to aggressive riding. I think that they'll probably wait and see in the first couple of mountain stages, see how Roglic is gonna bear up and how his team is looking. We've made a lot of the fact that the Jumbo-Visma team isn't the strongest and almost experienced in this Giro. So, I think the terrain is definitely there. It's certainly there to overturn a deficit of 3, 4, 5 minutes.
What's the latest with the Gavia and the snow and the bad weather and this rumour that the Gavia may not be passable and that there's a contingency plan to basically ride the Mortirolo twice, back to back, which would add around 20 kilometres to the stage route, making it sort of 243 kilometres instead of around 226. Well,
this has been mooted, and profiles of the proposed new stage have even appeared online. However, Mauro Vegni, the race director, hasn't publicly said that this is an option, and people suspect that it is the option, the B option, if the Gavia is not rideable. I think the big problem with the Gavia is not so much going to be the roads, it's the snow walls either side of the roads. We've seen these images in the past. The Gavia is almost synonymous with these images of the big snow walls either side of the road. At the moment, they're several metres high, and I can imagine that they might be slightly unstable and might be slightly unsafe, in which case the double ascent or 2 ascents of the Mortadella is an option, but it's right on the threshold of, well, lengthwise, it's almost 230 kilometers. That stage would be, and at the end of a Giro in which Vegni and the race organisers have been criticised for the length of the stages, I think it's a risk they may not want to take.
It is the first stage after the second rest day, so being 240 odd kilometres might not necessarily be such a concern. Daniel, just on the snow walls, you were saying about a few years ago the similar situation, and there was a press release come round basically telling everyone who was driving the course
On the Colle dell'Agnello.
not to toot their horns in case they started an avalanche. So that's the
encouraging.
Yeah, exactly. That's the kind of thing we're playing with there. I don't see necessarily a Contador style domination, but with the final time trial in Verona, at the moment everything is stacked in Roglic's favour, and we could see, once he gets himself back into the pink jersey, which really will be only a matter of time once the mountains come, surely, it's going to be a case of him versus the rest, isn't it?
Yes, we've talked a lot about his team, and not to labour the point, but it was an interesting move, Napalm. Jumbo-Visma announcing contract extensions for all 3 of his mountain domestiques. I think it was yesterday, and this is something that's it had probably been in the pipeline for a few weeks. These things generally don't get done in a matter of days or hours, but the timing was quite interesting. The fact that they've made it public, it did almost sound and seem like a bit of a vote of confidence for those guys who are going to be under pressure for the next couple of weeks.
Well, let's move on to the next question.
Hello everyone at the Cycling Podcast, it's Richard from London here, big fan of the show. I've got a question for the press conference. Primoz Roglic has lost a very important teammate in Laurens de Plus to illness. If we cast our minds back to day one in Bologna and the top of the San Luca climb, where Lionel interviewed de Plus, it was only after persuading him to stay at the top of the climb a bit longer than he wanted, having also done a TV interview. So my question is, would de Plus have avoided illness if he'd got back to his bus at the bottom of the hill a bit sooner? Did Lionel make him ill? Will it cost Roglic the Giro? Ultimately, will Lionel have cost Roglic the Giro now that he is minus Laurens de Plus?
That's a very familiar voice, Richard from London, and I think Richard from London will be hearing from my lawyers here, because I did nothing to jeopardise Laurens de Plus and his chances. I didn't keep him out in the cold any longer than he would have been. But I don't quite know how to take that accusation. I didn't sneeze on him. I haven't been ill myself, so no, nothing to do with me. That. Next question.
Ciao ragazzi, Paul Gatenby here, an Ital-Canadese living in Kent near Canterbury. We, the dear listeners, as Giro would put it, have heard from several cycling journalists that the Giro is arguably the most beautiful of the Grand Tours. Could you, our 3 esteemed podcasters, please share with us what riders in the peloton particularly strike you as being a pleasure to watch? Before I go, I understand Lionel enjoys his post-race meals con gusto. I would therefore like to offer you an expression from the region of Le Marche, which you might like to adopt as your mantra for the remainder of this year's Giro. Uomo di panza, uomo di sostanza. I will let TV's Daniel Freeb translate that one. Ciao ragazzi, buon Giro.
This is a question I think the Buffalo would have relished. He tends to talk about the aesthetics of bike riders quite a lot. Historically, going back a few years, when I first got interested in cycling, I used to think that Frank Vandenbroek looked fantastic on a bike, and that's part of the mythology, the mythos that grew around Vandenbroek. The great Pavel Tonkov, of course. Lionel, we had lunch today in, a restaurant, Piadineria, that belongs to the Pantani family, and we were overlooked by a picture of Pavel himself, the Tsar, in the 1998 Giro d'Italia. And I think in the current generation, to be honest, I think Nibali always looks great on a bike. He looks very dynamic, very aggressive, very smooth, very supple. Roglic looked great in the time trial yesterday. There's been a few articles I've read today, and it was also mentioned on the Italian TV coverage yesterday, just technically how perfect his time trial position was.
Yeah, interesting that Simon Yates said that he had watched footage of the time trial and was impressed by how smooth Nibali looked, and undoubtedly he does look smooth. What was it about Tonkov, though? I've never really fell for Pavel Tonkov, I must admit.
I don't know. At that age, when you first get into professional cycling, I think even maybe more than other sports, you're very susceptible to becoming quite infatuated with certain individuals, certain races. Tonkov was very impassive on the bike. He had a great poker face. His upper body didn't move at all. He was stoic. He looked stoic. I think he was often referred to, or mention was made of the fact that he was a Cossack. And I kind of had these images of him, with a kind of Davy Crockett. I didn't know much about the Cossacks, but I kind of imagined them with like a Davy Crockett style hat in the wilds of Siberia, sort of fighting wolves with spears. And I don't know, this all sort of built into a very sort of suggestive image in my imagination. I don't know what it was.
Fascinating. It won't surprise you to know that I've got a soft spot for the big rouleur, the kind of the tanks on the front of the bunch. I always when the Deceuninck Quick-Step team come to the front, always think they look great. They're all sort of technically very proficient, aren't they? There's not a lot of wasted energy that goes into their technique, is there? I mean, the big lads that can really put out the power, quite like that.
Very much like your running, which I witnessed earlier today.
Let's not talk about that.
Chute à l'arrière du peloton, cycling podcast team car at the back of the pack, please.
That's the voice of Seb Piquet, race radio at the Tour de France, interrupting our Giro press conference to remind me to tell you that this episode is sponsored by OS Maps. Firstly, Seb would fit right in Ravenna, wouldn't he? Very suave and sophisticated. I can imagine him, promenading through town,
glissading through town
in search of a pre-prandial drink. Anyway. Plan your next adventure with the award-winning OS Maps. For just £2.99 a month, you can get all of the Ordnance Survey maps for the whole of Great Britain on all of your devices. That's, computer, phone, and you can even print out the maps as well, so that if you're worried about losing the phone signal when you're out exploring, you need not worry. You can plot your own routes for walking, cycling or running. You can view drone-like footage of your route with 3D fly-throughs and explore what's around you, and get a free 7-day trial at osmaps.uk. Download the app from the App Store on whichever device you use, or sign up and pay just £2.99 a month and get all of the Ordnance Survey maps. And the beauty of the Ordnance Survey maps is you can kind of zoom in, can't you? You can start with the larger scale maps to get a bigger overview, and then look in more detail at the places that you want to discover, dig out the less travelled road, so to speak.
Napalm, I heard a good thing about maps the other day. Thomas, again, keeps all of the road books from all the Grand Tours that he does. And when he's on a Grand Tour, he'll often phone his wife, because he'll remember a stage from a previous Grand Tour that he's done. And he'll phone his wife and he'll say, can you look this up for me, because I've got a vague memory of it looking like tomorrow's stage. And I think sometimes she takes a picture and she sends it to him. So he's probably got quite an impressive archive. He's ridden a lot of Grand Tours.
Well, he's trying to ride all 3 Grand Tours this year, isn't he? This is the first, and he's got through the first week okay. So there we are. If you want to get all of the Ordnance Survey maps for the whole of Great Britain on your devices, go to osmaps.uk. Now, on with the press conference. We're going to have to rattle through some quick-fire questions, I think. So, next up.
Hi there, chaps. This is Ben Jones calling in from London. Really enjoying the coverage so far. I think the podcasts during the Grand Tours are absolutely exceptional. Not just the main podcast, but also Kilometre Zero. My good friend John and his wife had a baby just before the start of this Giro. And inevitably, I've been referring to young Barney as the Baby Giro. You mentioned in a podcast a few days ago about the Baby Giro. And I was wondering, who was the last person who won the Baby Giro and has gone on to win the main event, the main Giro? Sorry to put you on the spot, Daniel, but hopefully you have the answer. Cheers.
Danilo Di Luca. It was Danilo Di Luca.
So he won the
Il
Baby
Killer.
Giro in
1998.
and the real Giro in
He won
2007.
in fairly contentious circumstances in 2007. He was a rider who really, whose palmarès legacy was tarnished by a positive test one positive test in 2009, another one in 2013.
Indeed. Looking at the list of Giro, the Baby Giro winners, quite an illustrious list, but the names that leap out of me as winners of the grown-up Giro: Francesco Moser, Giovanni Battaglin. I know Claudio Corti on there winning in 1977. He was the boss of the Seiko team for a long time, wasn't he? And then Barlow World. Probably, I think that makes him Chris Froome's first sports director, doesn't it?
Yes.
Who else is on there?
Gotti?
Ivan Gotti, Marco Pantani, Gilberto Simoni. Why was the race not held for a couple of stints? Most recently, 2013, 2016. Was that a funding thing?
Well, Napalm, if you listen to the podcast, we did refer to this. The Baby Giro had a very controversial period where there were quite a number of scandals, doping scandals, and this combined with sort of difficult economic circumstances, and it suffered. It was relaunched in this Giro Bio format, as we talked about before, this kind of vegan sort of hipster get in the sea, kind of no mobile phones, only one race doctor format. It didn't go down well with everyone, but now it's been relaunched in a more conventional guise.
Next question.
Hi, this is Mark in Malpit Hill in Kent. I'm very much enjoying the daily podcasts. Prompted by the Kilometre Zero episode on fatherhood, I wanted to ask Richard and Lionel, as the dads on the podcast team, whether either of you were tempted to name your respective children after cyclists in the pro peloton, male or female, obviously. And also, do you know whether Lizzie Dignan's daughter was named Orla after Orla Chenoe? Thanks very much.
Well, I put this to Richard, and I'm not sure he wants his wife to know this necessarily.
Oh my gosh, this sounds terrible. What's coming?
No, but he said they decided to call...
never to talk about that.
They decided to call their son, give their son a French name, and so Richard's first starting point was the website Pro Cycling Stats to scroll through the names of French cyclists, and hit on Maxime. So... there we are. That's there's a cycling link there. I gather that Lizzie Dignan's daughter was not named Orla after Orla Chenoe. However, we considered calling our daughter Orla, but I thought it was too weird. Couldn't call our daughter Orla. That would be strange, wouldn't it? So no, we went for something different instead. Next question, please.
Hi guys, Kit here from Bristol. My question for the cycling podcast is, next year I'm planning on going visiting a Grand Tour for the first time. I was wondering which of the 3 tours you would recommend, which is your favourite as a spectator, and what are your top tips, what are your top do's and don'ts to ensure that you get the best out of the experience. Thanks, keep up the good work.
Well, first of all, Kit, the routes haven't been announced for next year. We know a little bit about some of the starts, don't we? We know that the Giro will start in Hungary. Is it next year the Tour starts in Nice?
Yes.
So we'll wait until the routes are revealed, and they will be revealed. The Tour always announced in October, and the Giro generally in November, and the Vuelta generally in December. So once the routes are out, you can see... I mean, generally, if you're going to watch a Grand Tour and you're flying from the UK, the simplest thing to do is plot it depending on which airports you can get to, really, and go from there. That's probably a logical way to plan your trip. It makes... the first ever time I saw the Tour de France on French soil, we went to a time trial, just because you saw every rider, and you had a whole day, rather than just to stand by the side of the road and they all whiz past and then what. Not saying that's not a great way to watch it. In the mountains it can be fantastic, the atmosphere and the build-up and the publicity caravan coming past and all of that. But a time trial gives you a real sense. You get to see everybody. And so that would be one of my tips. If there's an attractive looking time trial near a nice town, I would picked that.
Yeah, this year's Grande Partenza in Bologna would have been perfect, wasn't it? It was perfect. A big city, Bologna, a beautiful city, lots to do, lots to eat and drink, and as we said at the time, a fantastically designed prologue course. Logistically, it was a little bit challenging, but in terms of spectacle, it was absolutely fabulous. It was half a day's entertainment, so that would be a good idea. Generally, I think the Giro is a good race to go to as a spectator. You are not very restricted in terms of access. You can generally get around the team buses, which is not the case now at the Tour de France.
That's
the Tour
true.
de France, as of about 2 or 3 years ago, has created what they call a paddock area. So the general spectator is prevented from getting right up close to the team buses, whereas at the Giro and the Vuelta, that's generally not the case. You can kind of mingle with, even anyone who's got an accreditation. I think focusing on a city or at least a sort of provincial kind of town is a good idea, but just plan it well in advance. In Italy, it's not difficult to get good hotels for about 70, 80 euros a night. You can get something really quite fantastic a lot of the time. And I think at the Giro, well, we've said it before, but the Giro is kind of the right dimension for a bike race. It feels like a very big event without being out of control, without there being an awful lot of inconvenience involved in terms of closed roads, disruption to public transport, and so on and so on.
Yeah, I would definitely say Italy. I mean, the Tour de France is the biggest bike race in the world, of course, but Italy, pick somewhere that you would go for a weekend break, basically, because the food's fantastic, the wine's fantastic. If you pick a nice town, you've got other things to do around the cycling. So that would be my tip. But yeah, you can't go wrong really with a time trial. As much as I, in a sort of comedy way, criticise time trialling as a spectacle when watching on TV, for the roadside spectator, it offers a bit more bang for your buck because you get to see everyone.
The cycling podcast at the Giro d'Italia is supported by Science in Sport. Science in Sport, fuel by science.
Thank you very much to Science in Sport. Daniel,
yes.
You had a message on Twitter from the boss of Science in Sport, Stephen Moon, today, praising you for your solo break at the weekend.
Yeah, Stephen is a man with I trust Stephen. I don't think he's got any agenda, but a lot of the compliments I received from people connected with the podcast, i.e. maybe you and the Buffalo, I'm slightly more suspicious of.
Why? What, you think we're just buttering you up?
Yeah, I think their compliments might have been a bit backhanded. Anyway, let's crash on. Let's crash on napalm. It's all right. I'm all right. I'll get over it.
Anyway, thanks to Stephen Moon and Science in Sport, all of our listeners can get 25% off all of Science in Sport's products. That's energy bars, drinks, and gels. Whether you're going racing or riding a sportive or just training, and you want to keep hydrated and keep your energy levels topped up, or the thing that I've always found the most remarkable over the years is the recovery products, the stuff you drink after a big training ride or after a race, really replace everything that you've lost. Anyway, check out everything that Science in Sport sells on scienceinsport.com, and when you've filled your basket, use the code SISCP25 and you'll get 25% off the bill. Now on with the questions.
Hey guys, this is Ryland.
And this is Emily.
From the Peloton of Fun podcast. We're calling in from California.
We wanted to ask you your thoughts about the Tour of California. In particular, the fact that North America's biggest race,
and our only World Tour stage race,
takes place at the same times as the Giro. Would it perhaps be better if it was moved to a time where it wasn't overshadowed by a Grand Tour?
Thanks guys, keep up the great work.
Fight for pink.
It's great to hear from the Peloton of Fun podcast. Met them a few years ago now at the Tour de France, and I guess they've been at the Tour of California, or they've been paying more attention perhaps to the Tour of California than we have, because that's the thing, isn't it? I saw on sort of social media and read online the brouhaha about the 3K rule being bent slightly. This is the great thing. I don't actually know the full story of what happened, because when you're here at the Giro, it's like nothing else is really existing. And whenever I think about this clash between the Tour of California and the Giro, it brings to mind, I think, was it something that Bob Stapleton said to Richard, that if you're paying more attention to the Giro than the Tour of California, well, you're not paying attention. The inference being that the Tour of California was going to sail past the Giro in terms of importance and prestige on a big motorbike, and that just hasn't really happened. And I don't really know why, but it does seem that the Tour of California needs to be moved from this slot, clashing with the Giro, in order to develop any kind of stature. I'm not saying it's not a good race, but it doesn't pack a punch in terms of the field these days. I don't really know where they could move it to, because as we've talked about, the calendar is a bit of a jumble sale, isn't it? It's a bric-a-brac stall where you can't really see what you're looking for, and inevitably the Grand Tours do dominate at the times when they're on.
Correct, Lionel. I went to the first couple of editions first 3 editions, I think, of the Tour of California, and was captivated by it at the time, but it was in February back then. There were a couple of great storylines in those first couple of tours of California. In the first year, it was the local riders, so Floyd Landis and Levi Leipheimer, both based in California, and they really had prepared for that race, and it was a quite intense battle between those two. And in 2008, the Rock Racing team and Cipollini's comeback was a fantastic storyline. But since then, I think it's lost some of its luster since it's moved to June. And having said that, I'm kind of loath to pass judgment.
May.
I'm loath to pass judgment having not been there and having always been preoccupied with the Giro.
Yeah, it's a funny one, isn't it? Because as great as a race could be, the question that really should decide these things is, if you asked a rider, would you prefer to win the Giro or the Tour of California? And this goes for any race, really. What would you prefer to win? If there's a clear kind of like 90% mandate for one over the other, then that history and all the rest of it has kind of decided the answer.
Honest, there is not a single rider in the peloton who would rather win the Tour of California than the Giro. There isn't one.
Might there be someone who could win the Tour of California?
Even Arnold Schwarzenegger would rather win the Giro than the Tour of California.
Brilliant. Next question.
Hi guys, this is Matt from Virginia in the States. Go Joe Dombrowski. I had a question concerning race juries. You had talked about the juries relegating Viviani in stage 3, and I was just wondering about how a jury is composed, how many people are on it, and do they ever give interviews? Are you able to speak to them? Just some mechanics around how they function and how they make their decisions. Thanks a lot, guys.
Well, that's an interesting question. Who's on the race jury? Well, it's the UCI, the Union Cycliste Internationale, the governing body who put together the jury. How many are on it in the Giro?
There are 10 individuals, Lionel. 10, yes. Some of them are on motorbikes. Some of them have slightly different roles, where there is a commissaire, a member of the jury, who's responsible solely for the finish line and the finish line area. I think that means sort of photo finishes, that kind of thing. But they have a meeting at the end of the day. They go straight to, it's usually adjacent to the press room where they have their meeting, and they discuss any matters that haven't been resolved. Are they available for interview? They are, generally.
Famously, when the Peter Sagan, Mark Cavendish crash at the Tour de France a couple of years ago, Philippe Marienne was quite vocal, wasn't he? He was the head of the jury at the Tour de France there, and he did give quite a few interviews explaining.
They generally, I think it's left to their discretion. They generally don't say too much, but they're generally willing to explain why they've taken certain decisions.
But every day there's a press release or a communique explaining who has been fined and for what, and a lot of the things are team cars stopping on the wrong side of the road, or riders urinating in sight of the public. They're a couple of the most common ones, or riders taking a bottle or a feed in an area where they're not allowed to, or those are the kind of most regular things, or drafting for too long behind a team car. But every now and again, as with the situation with Viviani, on stage 3, they have to deal with something that affects the actual race result. And they don't wait necessarily for a complaint, do they? They don't wait for somebody to say, "Oh, wait, hang on, Viviani made it, flicked somebody into the barriers here. What are you going to do about it?" They watch the finish, from a number of different angles and make their decision, and then generally the team and the rider who have been penalised will object, and then the jury will either stick with their original decision or very occasionally will overturn it. But that's how it works. Next question.
Hello, this is Beth from Cambridge with 2 quick questions. First, how are climb categorisations decided? What makes one climb a Category 3 and another unclassified? Is it just the gradient? And 2, sports journalists will describe a descent as technical, but what does that mean exactly? Thanks.
Well, Bev, it's at the organiser's discretion. Certainly in the case of the Tour de France anyway, what makes one climb a Category 3 and another uncategorised? Well, a whole range of factors: the length of the climb, the steepness of the climb, the position in the stage. It's been the case in the Tour de France in previous years that the same climb one year could be an Or category, so the hardest, most difficult category, if it's towards the end of a stage, but if it's held right at the start of a stage, it might only be a first category climb. And so it's not just the gradient. I remember reading an interview with Thierry Gouvenou, the course director, the Tour de France, the man who plots the route of the Tour de France, really, saying that sometimes they'll make a climb. They'll offer King of the Mountains points on a particular climb because they want to ensure that the racing is underway and that they're going to encourage a bit of action. I know, certainly anecdotally anyway, in Italy, there have been situations where a difficult climb won't be categorised in the road book just to deceive the riders. But these days, with everyone reconning every stage, it's very little gets past the teams these days. But that's generally how it works. And the second question, what is a technical descent? Well, that's to do with the level of skill required to get down a descent. If there's a lot of sharp corners, or the camber goes from one way to the next, something that tests the handling skills of the riders as they go down. Generally, a technical descent is shorthand for a tricky descent, one that requires thought, a bit of luck maybe, and certainly some technical ability and bike handling skills. Next question, running out of time, probably only 2 last questions now. 2 last questions. I love that when the press officer steps in and says, 2 last questions. So,
no doping questions.
No, there haven't been any doping questions. That's amazing, isn't it? Maybe next week.
It's absolutely fine if someone wants to ask a doping question. We don't have a policy on that. No embargo.
No. I mean, we're not doping. I'm happy to say that.
To yourself. Anyway.
Next question.
Hi, this is Adam from London, long-time friend of the podcast. I just wondered your views on disc brakes in the peloton and why more teams aren't using them. Is it a weight issue? In which case, why aren't they just making lighter disc brakes, or is it a style thing, or is it a tradition thing? I just wondered what your views are. Keep up the good work.
Well, Adam, your question came in and we thought, well, as we were at the Mitchelton Scott team hotel this morning, we thought we would ask one of their mechanics. So I put your question to the Mitchelton Scott mechanic, Craig Greeter.
It's a good question, but for us it's a transition period where the riders get a choice. A lot of riders are just so used to riding on standard brakes that they like that. We have some guys here that have only been riding disc brake bikes the whole time at their choice. In the rain, a few more guys prefer to ride them because obviously the braking is much better. When we go into the mountains, we're still working on, there's a few grams extra because of the system. Some guys ride them, but a lot of guys prefer to be as light as possible, probably more psychological than anything. Some teams are only on disc brake bikes. All World Tour teams have them, and you do see somebody from each team generally riding them in every day in each race. A few teams just went straight out and complete disc brake bikes. We're in the process of changing over, and everybody does have them, but some people still prefer the traditional bike. I would imagine as technology goes and they work out what we're looking for, as well as we have to respect what they're trying to do with the market, I would guess within 1 or 2 more years everybody will more or less be on them.
Quite a few people asked about disc brakes, Daniel, because as Craig pointed out, we're in a kind of transitional phase here. We've got half the peloton on disc brakes, half the peloton on conventional brakes. Stephen from Belgium points out that Primož Roglic switched to disc brakes on one of the rainy stages because they perform better, and he asked, if they perform better, why don't they use them all the time? And it's a good question, but I think Craig kind of answered that there. It's to do with whether if there's a lot of climbing in a stage, they might not want the extra weight. But the concerns about for the mechanics have really receded in the last year or so as the technology gets better, and a kind of new generation of disc brakes means that, as Craig says, maybe in a year, certainly 2 years, everybody will be on disc brakes. And he did make the point after I'd asked him that question that the problem at the moment with the disc brakes and the conventional brakes both being in the peloton at the same time is you've literally got two classes of rider. You've got the riders on disc brakes who, especially in wet conditions, might think they can brake later into a corner, might approach a corner at a higher speed, and then you've got the guys on the traditional rim brakes who can't match that performance. And so that poses a little bit of a danger, and I can understand at the moment the riders being a bit nervous that some are on the disc brakes and some aren't, but I think that will change in the next year or so. I think time for the last question then.
Hey guys, Martin from Belgium here, friend of the podcast. I had a quick question about the bicycles that the riders ride at the Giro. Obviously, riders are given the bikes by the team sponsor, but I was wondering if you sometimes catch any inside information from riders that switch teams or teams that switch bike sponsors if they're more or less happy with the new bikes. For example, is Greg Van Avermaet less fast on a Giant bike rather than on a BMC bike? Or is Tom Dumoulin not as happy now that he's no longer on a Giant bike? I was just wondering if you guys had any inside information on stuff like that. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed the podcast and look forward to each episode.
Well, Martin, another tech question there. My sense from years covering cycling is that all the riders think their current bike is the best bike they've ever ridden.
Disagree.
Officially.
Definitely not unofficially.
No,
it's quite common to hear riders complaining about their bikes privately, but this is something they are very, very adamant about speaking off the record about.
Understandably,
they get in a lot of trouble if they criticise their bikes publicly. Consequently, it's very rare. Mark Cavendish kind of criticised his, or he expressed some reservations about the bike he was on last year, the Cervelo.
Well, it was more, wasn't it, that he said they couldn't match the Specialized, and it
Correct.
just so happened that Specialized were cleaning up in sprint wins with Peter Sagan and at the Giro Elia Viviani. So what puzzles me is in Formula One you always there's a kind of a secondary narrative, isn't there? The development of the car is almost a sort of season-long narrative. There's always a teething trouble at the start, and now have they solved that problem? Oh no, they've taken one step back in order to go two forwards, and it's a subcategory that maybe the car companies don't and the mechanics don't talk about explicitly, but enough of it seeps out, whereas that doesn't really happen in cycling, does it? It's almost like the taboo subject. You can't criticise the bikes, and even when talking to the Mitchelton Scott mechanic about disc brakes, he's careful not to criticise the company that are making the disc brakes, because they have the equipment that they're required to use because of the sponsorship deal, and nobody wins, I guess, if they're critical. But in some ways, the pro riders are the guinea pigs for the mass market, aren't they?
Yeah, they are, Lionel. There have been a few exceptions. Last year, there was what has become, I suppose, a famous exception when the Aqua Blue riders were quite privately. They were quite emphatic in their criticism and dislike of the 3T bike with the single chainring. But that wasn't only to do with the fact that it was this new concept with one chainring instead of two. It was also due to the weight of the bikes. Most of the bikes nowadays are very close to the UCI 6.8 kilograms limit. In a lot of cases, depending on the size of the rider, I think that bike last year wasn't.
Thinking about, if you're a rider, if you know you're not on the best equipment, that must really chip away at you day after day, I'd have thought. Well, Daniel, I think that is it from the press conference here in Ravenna. We've done our best to answer those questions.
One important question, Napalm.
Mm-hmm.
What are we going to eat tonight?
A good question, Daniel. What's the speciality of Ravenna? What should we be having?
Lasagna. is a bit of a speciality of Ravenna. We're in Romagna, of course. Still, we had a Romagnolo speciality at lunchtime, the piadina.
Yeah, which is kind of a flatbread sandwich, really, isn't it? You had more of a sort of pitta pocket, and I had a kind of flatbread sausage sandwich. It's quite nice, but you hear a bit more about that in a future episode.
Correct, Lionel. Few other things. I mean, Romagna generally is a region that's famous for fairly rich cuisine. Tortelli, so filled pasta, so filled parcels of pasta. Fritelloni, which are tortelli, so filled pasta but with spinach inside. They're quite famous from here. But generally, Lionel, I think it'd probably be up your street. I know, that's something you can probably say about any Italian city, but there'll be some meat, I think. Yeah, we'll probably get a proper dinner tonight, unlike last night.
Oh, can we have some kind of
lots
of
pig,
neutralised
lots
zone
of pork,
where
capelletti.
you stop mentioning my mess up last night?
Capelletti, maltagliati, like literally badly cut bits of pasta. Yeah.
Well, it's dinner time now, so thank you ever so much for all your questions. We'll be doing the same again on the second rest day. Normal coverage resumes tomorrow with stage 10. Thank you very much, Daniel.
Thank you, Lionel.
Se lo mangiano le femmine.
Che l'anna con l'acqua non fine, ci gira nella tenevo giardina che la